Some Reformed teachers will beat around the bush on this topic because, quite frankly, it's frightening. And the idea that God intentionally predestines certain people for hell goes against everything our culture believes about God. But where does our culture get what it believes about God? That's the question. Modern Christianity has painted God as if he set the world in motion and is patiently waiting to see who will choose to be saved. Hell is just this place where people choose to go. God doesn't send them there, they send themselves. And I suppose they pour out the wrath of God on themselves too while they are there to save God the trouble of tarnishing his good character with torture. As Flowers and his guests begins their discussion on this topic, it seems like they're trying to represent the position accurately. But then they ruin the doctrine by throwing a little bit of themselves in there. Listen to this and I'll explain what I mean.
All the great Calvinist thinkers, like the Mount Rushmore and again, a lot of that's pre-Calvinist. It's unfair to call Augustine a Calvinist, but that group of thinkers, they all affirmed that in some way you have to affirm that God, has ordained, obviously some unto salvation and some to damnation, but more specifically, that God in some sense has ordained the fall, right? There's really no getting around that one, and all of them are clear on that. And so you end up getting to a place where you realize you have to affirm something like God has ordained that the overwhelming majority of humans who have ever existed will, burn forever in hell, or however you want to conceive of hell, be in hell forever for sins that he ordained, and I think ordained is the word everybody could agree with, that they would commit. And not only that, but God in some sense desires this state of affairs, right? Because there's no reason why God could not have had it another way. God could have construed whatever will God wanted, but God desired that the overwhelming majority of humans would burn in hell forever for sins that he ordained they commit. And some Calvinists would probably quibble with some of that. But again, I think the most consistent and rigorous ones, the ones I respect the most, would all affirm that.
He starts by timidly presenting the accurate doctrine. God has ordained some for damnation. Yes. God ordained the fall. Yes. God ordained that the overwhelming majority of people who have ever existed will burn in hell for sins that he ordained them to commit. Wrong. This is not a new phrasing of their misunderstanding. Flowers says this exact phrase in almost every episode, but what are they getting wrong? Well, for starters, the vast overwhelming majority is not a statistic, and even if it was, I don't know where they are getting it from. It's just a tactic to exaggerate the claim as far as possible. The problem is, they think they have simplified this equation down to its most basic principles, but in reality, all they have done is removed several variables that would explain the full picture. Do they just not know about these variables? Or did something happen to them? Let's keep listening to find out.
So anyways, long story short, I got to a place where I realized that I had to sign off on that to be a consistent Calvinist. And that, for me, for various reasons, became a bridge too far biblically, theologically, and we can jump into any of that at any point you want. But it was for me, it was at that point where I most understood Calvinism, that I began to go, I'm not sure that this actually works and is the best way to make sense of what we see in Scripture. And I'm not sure if theology even becomes coherent if we believe that about God.
Okay, so here's his incorrect equation. God desires X, where X is people should burn in hell for sins that God ordained them to commit. This is never a desire that is expressed by God in Scripture. God's desire with creation is to glorify himself. Glorifying himself properly requires a certain set of variables. So here's how to build the real equation. What God desires is to be glorified for his righteous judgment of sin and his mercy toward sinners. Again, coming to this equation requires many variables. For instance, can God have mercy on sinners if there are no sinners? Can God righteously judge a sinner if there are no sinners? No. So, for God to glorify himself to the fullest extent requires the existence of vessels that can carry sin. These vessels are made in his image so that his sacrifice for them will be relevant and his judgment of them will be justified. The primary variable is that the death of Christ, being the hinge on which glorifying God's mercy turns, is what necessitates the fall of mankind. The death of Christ for sin was God's plan before the foundation of the world, at a time where sin did not have any physical manifestation. So here's the final equation with all variables intact. From eternity past, God desires X, where X equals J plus M multiplied by H, where J is God judges sinners righteously. M is God has mercy on sinners through Christ. And H is all of the other attributes that make up God's holiness, which can already be displayed amongst the Trinity without a creation in eternity past, which are now also being glorified with a creation. The fact that God decreed the specific sins that would take place is irrelevant. That's the way it must be, because nothing can take place unless God establishes it. If you need a direct verse for that, start in Lamentations 3, Psalm 139, but I want you to consider the narrative of Judas. In Dr. Flowers' equation, God desires that Judas would burn in hell for sins that he ordained him to commit. In the proper equation, God desired that the Messiah would be betrayed and handed over for execution. And he chose Judas to facilitate that. But Judas did not perform this prophecy like a puppet on a string controlled by God. We can see his motivation in the pages of Scripture. It was greed and cowardice in the heart of Judas that drove him to do what he did. And the fact that God ordained him to be this way is irrelevant. When Christ judges Judas at the great white throne judgment, that judgment is also within the bubble of God's eternal decree. So instead of God desires that Judas will burn in hell for sins that he ordained, it would be better said like this: God desires that Christ would judge Judas righteously for the sins that he committed because of his wicked heart, and God ordained all of that before the world began.
Yeah, well said. As is most of what you write, you have a really an art for putting things in a really clear, concise way. It's what I appreciate about your writing and your speaking, for that matter. And so, in your own journey, especially out of Calvinism, I know you've talked about one of the pictures that still resonates in my mind, at least from your book and from your interviews over the years that I've listened to, is that you give this imagery of a house, and you're in this Calvinistic house, and it's just everything's in the right order, and you're sitting and having coffee with Spurgeon and all the greats, and it's just a wonderful place, and you just hear this cry from the basement, so to speak, of the reprobate, and it's very similar to my journey. But you put it into a picture that I really related with, because that was kind of the thing that was always kind of gnawing on me behind the scenes as a Calvinist. When someone brought it up, I just like the doctrine of hell. I don't like the doctrine of hell even to this day. I still struggle with the doctrine of hell. I'm just being honest. When people bring up the doctrine of hell, I don't want to talk about it. I just don't, even from my perspective and what I believe about hell, because I don't like talking about things I can't grasp. I don't know how to deal with. And so I tend to bury it or tend to push it down.
Oh, this is wonderful insight into the theology of Leighton Flowers. At one point in time, the doctrine of hell and the doctrine of election were in the same category for him. I don't like it, I don't really grasp it, so I'm just going to push it to the side. But obviously, there is a clear distinction in categories for him now, as he continues to push the doctrine of hell to the side, but spends his every waking moment dreaming up new ways to attack the doctrine of election. So what is it that causes the distinction between these doctrines categorically? Well, he doesn't have to worry about hell. He can push it down and focus on teaching people that they should make the right decision and believe the gospel so that they can escape whatever hell happens to be. But here comes the doctrine of election to refute his idea of how to escape hell. If that doctrine is true, along with the other doctrines that are tied to it, that means that people don't have the capacity to make a decision to escape hell. And by nature of there being no other option, the doctrine of hell comes back rearing its ugly head, demanding him to come up with another way to escape it, apart from the grace of God. But there is no other way. The good news of the gospel is not that God has provided a way for anyone to escape hell if they so choose. The good news of the gospel is that God has paid for the sins of all who believe. Now you might say to me, that's not very good news for those who do not believe. He didn't say it would be good news to them. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 that what we preach is the aroma of death for those who are perishing. It is foolishness to them, and they cannot bear to hear it. That being the case, we should not be surprised concerning the reaction of these two. Religious men have been reacting this way to the gospel ever since Paul first interpreted it.